Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Bore da. Welcome to today's webinar, Your Exports and Free Trade Agreements, What Next? Today's is the third in a series of 4 Brexit-related webinars. The first 2 being Understanding Rules of Origin and Working with Agents and Distributors. Both of those were recorded and are available via the Business Wales YouTube channel, and they will also be shortly available via the Business Wales export zone as well. The 4th and final instalment will be on next Tuesday, the 6th of October, and that will be on customs declarations. I'd like to thank Winning Pitch and Go Exporting for producing today's webinar. Today's presenter is Mike Wilson, who is founder and CEO of Go Exporting. But before I hand over to Mike, I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping. So as mentioned, today's webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded again on the Business Wales YouTube channel and also the Business Wales export zone. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so please use the Q&A function to post any questions you have throughout, and we will review them. Anything we can't get to during today's session, we will endeavour to get back to you offline. And also lastly, after this session, we will be sending out a copy of today's presentation and also a feedback questionnaire. We'd be really grateful if you could take a couple of minutes to complete that and return it to us, because it really does help us improve these webinars. But that's enough from me, so I will hand you over now to Mike Wilson. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, John Paul. Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on free trade agreements and what's next post-Brexit. Just what we're going to cover today is what are free trade agreements, just a little bit more detail on their history, which post-Brexit free trade agreements are already in place or are under discussion, because that's very important for our future trade. What does all that mean for your Brexit strategy? So we'll take a closer look at the impact of free trade agreements and where we are now on how we move forward with export. And we'll also look at how to assess market potential post-Brexit, taking into account free trade agreements and deciding which countries are the best for you to export to. So just take a couple of moments, if I may, to tell you a little bit about us. Go Exporting, as the name suggests there, is a specialist export consultancy that successfully launches businesses into new international markets. We're passionate about export. We're also passionate about helping our customers get through the Brexit and COVID-19 challenges, and we put a lot of effort into providing services for that. I've got 30 years experience in export and international trade. As a company, we specialize in everything from export readiness to assessing opportunities, market research, market reports, deciding which countries to export to or which markets, and strategy and for opening those markets as well. And with some companies, we actually implement that strategy for them. We act as their export sales team. So we work to startups, SMEs, multinational corporates, and over the years, we've created more than 2 billion in export revenues. We also created the 7 Steps to Export Success ebook and program, which you can find more details of on our website. And it forms the basis of a lot of the services that we offer. So the first section, we're going to look at what are free trade agreements? What is their history? What is the definition of a free trade agreement? And then we're going to look at the anatomy of a free trade agreement. And they've changed over the last few years and become much more complex than they used to be. And then we'll look at what is their importance for you as a business moving forward. But first of all, we'd like to just do a quick survey, if we may, just to see how many of you have exported before and have experience of free trade agreements through Europe, so the European free trade agreements. So essentially, we're looking for people that have, how often you've exported outside of the EU. So we'll just launch that now. Okay, seems like everyone's voted, so I'll end the polling now and share the results. So as we can see here that frequently is the biggest proportion, so 68% of you have frequently exported outside of the EU, 18% regularly, but 14% just a few times. So some of this will be relevant, be more fresh for you. Okay, thank you for that. So the history of free trade agreements, they actually date back to ancient Egypt. The Roman and Ottoman and British empires were masters of free trade agreements, or of trade agreements rather. Some were peaceful, some were military, and often they were more about protecting traders from arrest or seizure in foreign countries rather than eliminating barriers to trade. The Romans and ourselves, the British Empire, used force to gain access to colonial markets in a lot of cases, but they were the forerunners of trade agreements. Agreements purely based on trade interests started around the 18th century, and Britain has always been at the forefront of promotion of open trade and looking to relax trade barriers. The first recognized international trade agreement, which involved significant reciprocal tariff reductions, is known as the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, which was entered into between the UK and France in 1860. And that actually triggered a wave of similar treaties across Europe. Countries saw that there may be benefits into this type of agreement and started looking at who they could enter into agreements with. But that stopped when we got to, or certainly got harder when we got to the Depression of 1873 to 1877. That really revived protectionism because everyone was worried about their own economies and wanted to protect their own industries, and felt that the best way to do that was to stop other countries from selling into them. But then after the war, after the Second World War, GATT was created. GATT is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that was really a precursor to today's WTO. In fact, WTO incorporated GATT into its rules and regulations. GATT was signed in 1947 by 23 countries. And its idea was to minimize barriers to international trade by eliminating or reducing quotas, tariffs, and subsidies. And it introduced the most favored nation principle. That led to the creation of the WTO in 1995, which absorbed GATT. Most favored nation principle we'll come on to a little bit more in detail later on. So the WTO started in, say, in 1995. We'll look at a little bit about the history of the WTO and its growth in a moment. That saw the growth then of bilateral free trade agreements. So that's free trade agreements between two countries. So similar to the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty that we just mentioned. There's been a move in recent years to more regional free trade agreements. So for example, the EU is actually an example of a very advanced type of free trade agreement. It takes everything a stage further, for example, with the customs union involving a number of countries. Then you have the TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TPP, which is a Trans-Pacific Partnership, and RCEP, which is regional cooperation in Asia and the Pacific. So there's been a number of these regional free trade agreements that have sprung up in more recent years. So this is an example just to show you the TPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So you can see that this incorporates a number of countries: Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and across the other side of the Pacific, you've got Canada, Mexico, Peru, and Chile. So those countries have entered into this comprehensive agreement between them. They account for around 13.9–14% of GDP from the global economy, and 6.7% of the global population, with 15.2% of overall world trade is between those nations, or comes from those nations. Korea alone is 23.3% of that total. So you can see it's a significant trading bloc, and that's the kind of agreement which has been entered into more and more frequently in recent years. But what is the WTO? We hear a lot about it. World Trade Organization. We hear politicians talking about we're going to have to fall back on WTO rules. It could well be a disaster, and so on. But what is the WTO, and what's its history? So the World Trade Organization was established in 1995. It is the world's largest international economic organization. It actually started with 125 nations, and 90% of global trade was covered by those nations. And as we can see, it now has 164 members that cover 98% of world trade. So we are part of the WTO already via the EU, as are most other countries in the world. So it creates, this regulates and monitors trade in goods and services and intellectual property between its member states. So, and it incorporates GATT, as we saw earlier. So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was incorporated into the WTO and formed the basis of its trading agreements at the beginning. So the WTO actually agrees and sets maximum tariffs for most favored nations. And the most favored nation is where all nations are treated equally on tariffs and trade, unless there is a free trade agreement between those countries. So the WTO says that every country should treat each other equally, and these are the maximum duties that will be charged. It is up to a country if you want to charge less, but there is a maximum, and if you charge less to one country, you have to charge it to them all. So the WTO also has a framework for negotiation and dispute resolution. So if there are any challenges, or if anyone thinks there's dumping, for example, going on, the WTO has a framework for those to be discussed and negotiated and to be resolved. And the idea is that everyone works to one set of rules and principles. One of the key ones is non-discrimination. So it's one tariff rule applies to all. Also, there's an agreement that there'll be no discrimination on imports regarding as compared to national goods. So for example, on standards or on any kinds of barriers to entry, each will be treated equally. You can't, for example, say that if a good's being imported, it needs to have a higher standard or a different standard than goods that are produced in the country to be sold into the market. Sorry. Next is reciprocity, which is difficult to say, but that guards against favoritism and free riding. So again, it's a little bit like the non-discrimination, following on from that and enhancing that, so that countries can't have their favorites. Everything has to be to all different countries. So thirdly, they have to be binding. There are binding and enforceable commitments. So if a country does transgress, there is this negotiation and dispute resolution, and the WTO can take action against them. The tariffs are published and they're visible. They can be changed, but not unilaterally without consequences. So everything is open. So as we say, transparency is key. Members must publish their trade regulations, and also they must respond to requests for information from other members, and notify any changes in trade policy to the WTO. There are some safety valves built in there. So in specific circumstances, members can restrict trade, for example, to protect the environment, public health. We're in a great example of that at the moment, aren't we, with COVID-19. So members can restrict trade in certain ways for certain conditions, such as the public health crisis, and also for animal and plant health. There can be areas where they can change their trade policy. So looking a little bit further into the WTO then, so its aim is to eliminate quotas and to reduce duties. In its documents, it has around 5,200 or over 5,200 duty rates. It's all based on the harmonized standard code. And what we're showing here are some examples of average duty rates. This is taken across the harmonized standard codes for these particular categories, so it may not be specific to your product. You do have to check specifically what the duty would be under a WTO for your particular product. But as you can see, some of these can be quite substantial. Dairy, WTO could be 37.5%, confectionery 21.2%, animal products 16.3%, fish 11.6%. And as we're moving down, cars and car parts 7%, chemicals 4.6%, petrol just 2.5%, electrical machinery 2.3%, non-electrical machinery only 1.8%. Pharmaceuticals are generally zero. So you can see that there are quite high rates there. So if we've been used to dealing with the EU with zero rates, then this could just come as quite a shock and have quite an impact on our exports to the EU in particular. Those of you obviously who have been exporting outside of the EU will have already come across some of these rates for your products, and may be aware of them unless you've been dealing in an area which has a free trade agreement already. So what is the definition of a free trade agreement? It's a reciprocal agreement between two or more countries according to international law. So its idea is to reduce barriers to trade, to increase trade between countries basically, and to reduce or eliminate tariffs and quotas. But it is specific to the signatories. So it's outside of the WTO rules and only applies to the signatories to the agreement, which is one of the issues we're going to have moving forward, because at the moment we work with countries outside the EU on EU free trade agreements, which we will no longer be a signatory to. So we will need to work our own free trade agreements. But we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So, other definitions of a free trade agreement: it's not allowed to restrict either signatory from entering into other free trade agreements with other countries, with other third parties. And it must substantially cover all goods and services in the sector. It shouldn't be allowed to just pick one sector, for example, agriculture, and just have a free trade agreement on that in that area. It should cover the majority of goods and services, although some can be excluded for various reasons, which we will see in a moment. Free trade agreements are permitted under the WTO rules, so they do not affect the most favoured nation status of the countries that sign them. That's one of the rules of the WTO. But again, you can't pick and choose the areas to liberalise. They must be across the board, and the free trade agreements, must not worsen the pre-agreement situation for non-signatories to that free trade agreement. So, the UK and USA can't sign an agreement which will be in detriment to the EU if they've got a free trade agreement with the UK, for example. So it can't be detrimental to the pre-agreement situation. Trade in goods and services is central to the agreement. That's the core. But modern free trade agreements do encompass a lot more than just trading goods. They may also cover trade facilitation and rulemaking. So, for example, rules on investment. Sometimes that's to protect investment, so that if you invest in a foreign country, you have some kind of legal protection through the free trade agreement that you'll be able to, the money will be secure. Also, intellectual property is covered by many free trade agreements, as it is under WTO rules. So you have some levels of protection there. And government procurement is another area that is generally covered these days in modern agreements so that governments can't favour their home companies, for example. They have to be open and accept tenders from foreign companies as well. There also now tends to be standard agreement on technical standards, so that there's either acceptance of each other's standards or acceptance of an international standard. Again, we'll look a little bit more in that in more detail in a moment. And then there will be an agreement often on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, so on animals and plant health, for example. There may well be agreements to accept each other's standards or to ease the burden of licenses and so on. So they're example. That's the kind of things that goes into reciprocal agreements. There are non-reciprocal agreements that do exist. So, for example, developed countries like the UK, like the EU, will often grant preference or opportunities to developing countries. These are called the GSP countries, and that's the generalized system of preferences. So it grants reduced tariffs for goods from designated developing countries in order to help them to develop. But the majority of free trade agreements that we're interested in will be reciprocal, so the same treatment for both parties. So that's what a free trade agreement is. But what's made up in it? What's the anatomy of a modern free trade agreement? It goes beyond pure WTO rules. Otherwise, there's no reason to actually enter into a free trade agreement if it doesn't go beyond WTO rules. So it generally these days goes for a deeper integration. So it's not just an agreement on trade, it's an agreement on some of the areas that we just looked at in standards and so on. Some examples: non-economic issues are therefore often included, like environment and so on. It can take years to conclude because of this, because of the complexity. You have, for example, the CETA, which is the agreement between the EU and Canada, stands for the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. These and the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, they are examples of deep integration free trade agreements. But as you can see, they took many years to negotiate. With Canada, it was 9 years. The EU-Japan agreement was 6 years. And the EU agreement with South Korea was 9 years. So on average, the USA takes 5.5 years to agree a free trade agreement once it's decided to enter into negotiations. So the agreement that we're trying to enter into with the EU is a deep integration free trade agreement, as we know. It's covering much more than just our trade tariffs. There's a lot of strings and mutual agreements there on things around trade and around the way we operate that go into such an agreement. The agreements that we negotiate with outside of the EU will also most likely be deep integration of free trade agreements if they're reflecting or mirroring the current agreements that the EU has with these countries. So as we can see, it's very complicated. It takes a lot of negotiation. So, what chance by the 31st of December, the end of this year, that we'll have free trade agreements with maybe not even the EU, let alone all the other countries that we would like to have one with. So it's definitely a difficult, complicated area that but a very important area that we need to take into account in our business. So the latest agreements go well beyond mere tariffs and quotas. They go into a lot more detail than that. So the anatomy of a modern free trade agreement, if we look at it to a little bit more detail now, it's broken down, as we've said, into different sections. So you've got the trading goods, which we'll look at again in more detail on the next slide. That's the central point, the cornerstone, if you like, of free trade agreements. But as we've seen, they do now incorporate so much more. So, for example, most free trade agreements will include agreements on trade in services. Now, these are not hindered generally by tariffs, but by laws and regulations. So, for example, the CETA agreement with Canada has concessions on nationality requirements for lawyers, accountants, architects, and engineers, for example, practicing in Canada. And it has procedures for temporary entry into Canada for professionals, which can be very important if you're providing a service from the UK into Canada, for example, and you need to send your own staff over there. There is this within the agreement with the EU anyway, there's procedures to allow them temporary access into the country for that. In most free trade agreements, it's only modest concessions that are made, and it's it may not be that significant. But one area that does often get included is mutual recognition of qualifications. So you may find that the qualifications of an architect in the EU is accepted by Canada, for example, which is not always the case, and it saves people having to re-qualify or take further examinations. So that can be quite an important part of mutual recognition of trade in services. Next is provisions on foreign investments. This is to remove barriers for you to invest in overseas markets, to make it easier basically to invest, and also to protect that investment once it's in the country. There's always that risk. What will happen if I invest in this country? I can give an example of Cemex, for example, the cement producer. They're a Mexican-based company. They invested a lot of money into Venezuela many years ago, had many cement plants there. And then the Venezuelan government decided they were going to be nationalized and basically did not pay the market rate anywhere near it for those assets and just took them over. So protection for investments once in country can be a very important part, a very important provision in free trade agreements. And usually they'll include a dispute settlement mechanism that incorporates a neutral court. So, it will be, if it's the UK and the EU, maybe the agreement will be that any disputes are settled in Switzerland, for example. So it's outside of the EU area. The next area that's often included now is government procurement. And this stipulates that governments must treat foreign goods and suppliers as they would a domestic supplier when it's in a public procurement. The WTO also has a government procurement agreement within its set of guidelines and rules. It's one of the conditions of membership that companies sign up to that. But often free trade agreements may go over and above the WTO GPA rules in order to encourage market entry. Again, using the example of the EU-Canada agreement, the CETA agreement, that also binds provincial and municipal governments into this government procurement agreement, which the standard GPA of the WTO does not. So it goes a step further. And again, that can be an important aspect in helping to open the market for you to encourage market entry into your areas, into that area. Intellectual property is another area which again is often enhanced compared to WTO. WTO has what they call TRIPS, which is trade-related aspects of international property rights. So, for example, we're talking about copyright, trademarks, designs, patents, geographical indicators, GIs is called, such as for Parma ham, cheddar cheese, that kind of thing. There are protection for those kind of things within the WTO rules. Free trade agreements may contain enhanced protection for those. For example, copyright may be extended, or there may be extended GI, geographical indications listings, which will help to protect certain products when they go into an international market. For example, traditionally GIs have struggled in North America, but the Canada agreement with the EU protects finally products such as gorgonzola, feta, Munster cheese, and so on, Parma ham. So these products which come from a specific area are now, or within a free trade agreement, maybe have an enhanced security within the agreement. And of course, that's one of the reasons why countries enter into free trade agreements, to protect their own products and to enhance the sales, the exports of their own products in international markets. Finally, free trade agreements will often include sustainable development, such as environment, labour rights. There's this concept of social sustainability. So it's inherent in a free trade agreement that it won't affect the standard of living in one country. So, for example, if the free trade agreement opens up the market for agriculture, for example, in one country, but that's completely detrimental. It kills the farmers in the other country, and that would not be accepted as social sustainability. The government shouldn't have entered into it in the first place, but if they did, then this will help to protect them. So if they do see any downturn in the local market because of the free trade agreement, there'll be some kind of mechanism for discussion. Also, there's the right to protect public interest. So, you know, if there is anything that comes up which is not right, it can be discussed. And often there'll be an agreement to comply with international treaties, for example, on labour and on environment. As an example, the EU-Japan EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement, commits both parties to high standards of corporate governance. So it aims to bridge the gap between the corporate cultures between the two countries. You know, Japan and the EU have completely different cultures in terms of business. So this aims to increase transparency, to look at cross shareholdings, which is common in Japan, but not in the EU, and where decisions are based on loyalty, which again is a common factor in the Japanese culture. So the agreement, the EU-Japan EPA, looks to bridge the gap between those two cultures, and that's an example that that many free trade agreements include this kind of discussion in their terms and conditions. But as you can see, it's very complicated. It can take years to negotiate, and because of that, you know, it's bound to use the basis of recent agreements when we're moving forward. So the reason I'm giving the examples of the Canada agreement with the EU and the EU-Japan EPA is that most likely we will use those as a template, if you like, for negotiating with other countries, and we'll try and mirror those types of agreements moving forward. So all these different elements will be included in free trade agreements that we look at. So now if we look at specifically the trade in goods. So this is, as we've said, is the central point, the cornerstone of free trade agreements. But all the other things are important, but this is the starting point, if you like, and how free trade agreements came into being. So the first thing is that free goods and trading goods will look at customs duties and trade facilitation. So the idea is that we'll reduce or eliminate tariffs on most goods. The negotiations typically focus on goods for which the WTO tariff is high. So for example, in agriculture or dairy. And that can lead to significant advantages for the signatories over most favoured nations status in the WTO rules. As we've seen, the tariffs there can be quite high. Dairy was 37.5%. So if you can enter into a free trade agreement where that's zero or next to zero, then that gives you a significant advantage dealing with your trading partner than the countries which are just under standard WTO rules. So as an example, again, the CETA, the EU-Canada free trade agreement, eliminates in total 99% of tariffs between the two countries. but 90% on agriculture. So it doesn't have to include all products, but it does have to cover substantially all products. The EU-Japan EPA, within that, the EU abolished 99% of duties, and the Japan only 97%, because that takes into account sensitive products for Japan, such as rice, seaweed, whale products. So there can be differences, and this is where the negotiations get difficult sometimes and tricky. So the FTA therefore does not always cover 100% of products. So even if a free trade agreement exists, you do need to check to make sure that your products are covered within that agreement. And the focus is usually to remove barriers for key products. So, for example, the EU-Japan EPA is known as the Cheese for Cars Pact. And the reason for that is obviously Japan is very keen on enhancing their export of cars, and the EU is very keen on enhancing its export of cheeses, which previously had been very high duties in Japan. So the EU committed to phase out 10% duty on cars over 7 years in return for reduced duties from Japan on cheese, wine, beef, pork, for example. They also agreed to reduce or work together to speed up clearance processes, to speed up customs procedures. So again, that's a key area that's often included in a free trade agreement in the trade in goods section. They want to make it easy for each other to be able to trade with each other, which we've obviously had with the EU over the last number of years. It's been a completely free trade agreement. We've also had the customs union, so there's been free movement of goods around the whole of the EU. That's obviously going to stop. The idea of a free trade agreement is to make those new customs procedures as easy as possible. Although it has to be said they're not going to go away. There will be additional customs procedures. We've already mentioned agriculture a little bit within customs duties and trade facilitation, but we have put it there as a separate area because it does become such a key part of trade negotiations with free trade agreements. It's generally the hardest tariff reductions to achieve, but can provide the biggest opportunity, the biggest benefit over WTO rules. So within again, looking back at the EU-Japan agreement, Japan abolished 15% tariffs on wines and became duty-free on certain cheeses, where previously there had been 30 to 40%. So specific agreements on agricultural products is key. Again, that becomes difficult because of wanting to protect your domestic farmers, for example. So it's a key area. Rules of origin, we did a full webinar on this last week. It's an important element of all free trade agreements, and they have to be specified in order what the rules are, the rules of origin, in order to comply with the free trade agreement. It's a key area, and it will be a key area for any UK-EU free trade agreement and the UK agreement with other countries post-Brexit. How is the rule of origin specified in the agreement? And we look at the different ways, which is wholly obtained. So if all the components are obtained within the originating country, or if there's sufficient process, which we looked at previously. So where there's enough, there may be non-originating goods included in the product or components, but there's been sufficient transformation within the country or additional components added that it becomes accepted as sufficient process has taken place, so it becomes origin of that particular country. Now, this is again, it's a very important area and also a very complicated area. For example, in the CETA agreement with Canada, cars must have 50% components from either Canada or the EU. In the EU-Japan agreement, only 45% is allowed. Now, again, that can be very important. We've seen that just a couple of days ago, the car industry has announced that they're very concerned about the EU UK free trade agreement negotiations and how components and how the designation of UK origin is going to be agreed. At the present time, there's something called cumulation or value added, so that within the EU, any products, any components from the EU added to used in the UK become British origin. But unless that's agreed when we come out of the EU, it may be difficult for a UK car manufacturer, for example, to prove that his product is UK origin. The UK Car Manufacturers Association reckons that around 41% only of products in a UK car have been sourced in the UK. And actually probably only 25% of those are real UK origin products. So that will be very difficult without this concept of cumulation, where EU components will be classed as UK as well to prove UK origin, and may have a profound effect on the duties that are applicable to your products. So it is something that, again, we went into a lot of detail in the last webinar. So if you didn't attend that, then that is available on the Welsh Government website. Also, within rules of origin, there will be an agreement on what the procedures are, how you go about it, how you go about proving origin. And usually the idea is to ease the proof, the burden of proof of origin, without actually relaxing the rules of origin thresholds, of course, but they are looking to make it as easy as possible. The next area is technical barriers to trade. So the idea is to work towards common standards on safety, health and consumer protection, for example. Is maybe to agree on accepting international standards, or agree to accept each other's standards to make it easier for one country to sell to another. For example, in the Japan EU EPA, that specifies acceptable standards, for example, on labelling, which has previously been an issue for EU companies trying to sell to that area. And the Canada Agreement allows competent bodies in either country to certify against the other's standards. So, for example, you can get Canadian approval within the EU and vice versa, which makes things a lot easier to actually get approval for your product to get into the country. It may also be that the agreement will have an element of mutual recognition. And what that means is that the countries mutually agree that they will accept the other standards. And that may not be across all sectors, it may be in specific sectors, for example, in medicines. In the Japan EU agreement, that was agreed with motor vehicles, for example, that with cars, that the EU would accept Japanese standards and vice versa, so for entry. Although, as we've seen, there will also be this element of 45% non-originating products. You need to get over that threshold in order to claim EU origin for the product. And finally, within trading goods, there is the sanitary and phytosanitary measures, so animal and plant health and cleanliness, for example. And often the idea is to look at mutually accepting other standards. But again, that's not guaranteed, and it can be a difficult area. For example, things are not always aligned. If we look at North America as compared to the UK or EU, North America allows hormone-fed meat, chlorinated washed chicken. So these kind of things are not allowed in the UK or the EU, and they could make a free trade agreement between the UK and the US very difficult moving forward, because if the US tries to stipulate that these things must be included. And it can also look at procedures such as pre-authorization of facilities. So if your facility for producing food in the UK, maybe you can get a pre-authorization within a free trade agreement from the other country, which would make things a lot easier. So as we can see, even within trading goods, there are a lot of elements to actually reaching an agreement, which can take quite a long time to actually reach some kind of consensus. So what are the importance of free trade agreements? Well, without a free trade agreement, the UK and the EU will trade on WTO terms as from the 1st of January 2021. There's going to be no extension to that. That's the government has said there'll be no extension. So that's the situation. Unless we reach an agreement, we'll be trading on WTO terms. That could well make your products less competitive, whether you're importing or exporting due to duties. And of course, there will be more red tape if there's no free trade agreement, which eliminates some of the free trade, some of the red tape. So, for example, there may be an agreement within a free trade agreement on simplified procedures for customs. It's already reckoned the customs declarations are going to increase by sixfold. But if there's some way of simplifying that procedure, then that can obviously have a big effect on saving money and costs and time in actually doing that. So free trade agreement can be very important, as it can be for licenses and certificates that will be required. Again, that's a very important area. We've already talked about the sanitary and phytosanitary certificates and licenses. You have to go through a full procedure for every time you're shipping, or if those procedures aren't simplified or harmonized in some way, it can be quite a burden. Next, there may well be could be compliance difficulties if there's not a free trade agreement. We've seen that the goal is to accept each other's standards, or to agree on an international standard which will apply. But when we look at what's going to happen moving forward, for example, with CE, the UK is introducing its own UK conformity assessed standard, and it's not certain that there'll be mutual recognition of the two. Certainly, the UKCA will cover most of the same products as CE, and there will be a transition phase where CE marking will be accepted in this country until January 2022. But the UKCA will not be accepted in the EU in that period. So to sell in the UK and the EU moving forward, you'll have to have both, unless there's some agreement to the contrary. CE conformity assessments carried out in the UK by notified bodies may no longer be recognised by the EU as well, for example. So again, that could be a whole host of admin and costs and time that you'll need to look at. Also, there will be may be no recognition, no mutual recognition, as I've said, of non-harmonised goods if there's no deal on standards, for example. So compliance difficulties shows the importance of a free trade agreement and overcoming and easing so many of those factors that could make our daily lives extremely difficult. Rules of origin issues. Well, we've already discussed this to a certain extent. We now will need to prove UK origin and not EU origin. And that will affect our duties, standards, quotas, and so on in the trade agreements. Supply chains, as we've seen, can be complex. As we've just looked at the car industry, 41% only is UK sourced, and maybe only 25% of that is UK origin. It's a complex area, and it's something you need to study to see how your supply chain stacks up, and if you can prove UK origin for the product. And will value added and accumulation be included? That's, as we've seen, can be quite critical. Will EU products be classed as British in terms of proving our origin within a free trade agreement with the EU? But not only with the EU, when we talk into third countries, we'll need to try and agree that as well in many cases, and that could well be extremely difficult. And it's reckoned that there will be additional costs in all of this of perhaps between 4 and 15%. So then you have to work out whether actually that's worth the effort to gain the preference and the reduced duty compared to the WTO rules. It depends, the rates, depends on what those rates are. So The other, we'll have no access to EU free trade agreements with other countries. So how long is all this going to take to negotiate? On what terms, for example? The US has already talked about demanding access to the NHS or the acceptance of chlorine-washed chickens, for example, in order to enter an agreement. So there's a lot of very difficult negotiations moving forward. And as we can see, there's a lot of, it's an important discussions for us as business people in the effect it's going to have on our exports moving forward. So just a sort of recap as to where are we now? Well, the UK officially left the EU on the 31st of January, we know this. We're no longer an EU member state. We're in this transition period to the end of the year. The government announced on the 12th of June that it won't extend any further to the end of the year. But until then, we remain in the single market and the customs union. And we are trying to enter into this deep integration, comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. And Boris Johnson set a deadline of the 15th of October for that. Michel Barnier says the end of October. Well, history shows that these deadlines will be extended time and time again, and there could well be a 12th-hour agreement. The supposed final round of negotiations are taking place at this moment in time. But as yet, we're yet to see any particular progress in those. And then, as we know, the UK has threatened to break the withdrawal agreement, and therefore international law in September. It announced this and brought a new bill in Parliament. It's just been announced today, in fact, just before we came on air, by the EU that they will take legal action against the UK because of this. So things are hotting up and negotiations are getting tough. Will there be a deal or won't there be a deal? Well, that's some commentators say that the negotiations are going well behind the scenes, and a lot of this is just front and politicians' negotiations, but the actual agreement, the negotiations are going quite well. Well, let's hope so, and we'll wait and see. And of course, not only do we need, an agreement with the EU, we also need to mirror the EU's agreements with free trade agreements with other countries. So that's where we stand at the moment. So what are the biggest issues for entering into a free trade agreement with the EU? Both parties want to reduce duties and quotas to zero. That's clear. But the EU has certain conditions that it is putting onto that. For example, it wants us to commit to environment, labour, climate change and state aid agreements, which we must legally commit to, as long as we're going to stick to the legal agreements when we get them. And that EU state aid rules will apply. Now, state aid is one area which does seem to be a particular sticking block at the moment in the negotiations. And also the EU wants, well, the UK wants to retain full autonomy to be able to do what it wants, basically, but still have a free trade agreement. As we've seen, it's not unusual to have these kind of non-economic policies in a free trade agreement, but the UK is trying to minimise the impact and to keep its negotiation or its wiggle room as much as possible. The EU also wants access for EU vessels into our fishing areas, but the UK is restricting that, trying to restrict that, and wants it to be renegotiated annually. So it's definitely difficult discussions ahead. As I say, the final round of discussions is in progress now. They have extended talks on fisheries and the subsidies. So there are scheduled meetings in an attempt to reach an agreement this week. So let's keep our fingers crossed that that does happen. So now obviously it's clear that free trade agreements are very important for us, but which ones are already in discussion, which ones do we need, and which ones are already in place? So we look at, first of all, where our main export destinations are. As we can see, the EU is our biggest export destination. So I reckon it's 46% of goods and services. These figures on this graph show goods. The USA is our next biggest one, despite the fact that we don't have any free trade agreement with them. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, and then Switzerland, China, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, India. So that shows the the key areas that that we export to. And many of these, some of these actually under free trade agreements with the EU, some not. So where have we signed trade agreements already? These may not be complete free trade agreements, but they're limited trade agreements in some cases. You can see a list there. This is straight from the government website. So we can see the Central America, we'll just pick out some, Chile. We do have an agreement with Iceland and Norway. But that's an agreement really in principle, because that could well change depending on the agreement which is reached with the EU, because Iceland and Norway are part of the EFTA, the European Free Trade Area. So that could well be changed by the EU agreement. We have an agreement with Israel, Lebanon, and so on. Switzerland, which was quite a big partner for us, we've already reached an agreement with them, so that's good. As we have with Southern Africa Customs Union, for example. And one of the big ones is the UK-Japan trade deal, which has just been agreed in principle last month. So that mirrors in many ways the EU-Japan agreement, which I've been talking about as we've been going through it. Then there's a number of trade agreements that we're discussing. Some of them with not so significant trading partners, but some of we pick out some big ones. Singapore was on our list. Turkey is another big one, as well. Some of our main exporters. So we are in discussion with a lot of countries. We're trying to open up discussions. There have been pre-discussions, if you like, with the US. So the government is on it, but let's see how much progress is actually being made. There's also some post-Brexit mutual recognition agreements that have been entered into. This is where we're recognising other countries' conformity assessments, their standards, for example. So we've entered into that with Australia, New Zealand, with the USA already. Japan, as we've seen in principle, as we've already entered into an in-principle agreement with them. Switzerland, it's included as part of the trade agreement that we've signed with them, as it is with Israel. So we are making some progress. But there's a lot more that needs to be done in order to get to where we are with EU free trade agreements. So we'd just like to do another quick viewer poll here, if we may. So what percentage of your exports are outside the EU? None, up to 25%, between 25 and 50%, or over 50%. So I'll just launch that poll. Okay, I'll just give you a few moments to look through that. Okay, I think everyone's finished now, so we'll end the polling. I'll just share the results. So we've got 4% of you who don't export outside the EU at all. 46% of you, it's just up to 25% of their exports are outside the EU. 29% between 25 and 50%, and 21% that export a lot outside the EU. So that gives us a good indication. So there's going to be this area here, the non up to 25%, that there's going to be quite some changes potentially to what you've been doing up to now. Thank you for that. So what does all this mean for your export strategy? So I thought we'd have a look at, Brexit is one big big effect on export. So as part of that, so free trade agreements, but obviously in this day and age, I thought we should mention COVID-19 and what we should be doing about that. Let's start by quickly just looking at what are the benefits of exporting, which we all know, but it's gain additional sales, gain economies of scale, so to be able to increase our production with the same basic cost base, to reduce our local market dependency, so we can, if the UK market is down as it is now because of COVID-19, then perhaps other markets will still be buoyant, although in a global pandemic that's not necessarily the case. Innovation, gain competitiveness, you expose yourselves to new ideas, new ways of working, which can have a positive effect on your business. But in the end of the day, we're looking to increase profits. That's our main goal with anything that we do, but in particular with exporting. So COVID-19, where are we now? Should we all be self-isolating our businesses? Well, my answer is no. By looking to export still, we're spreading the risk. Not all markets are down. Some sectors are still buoyant, and the infrastructure, for example, a lot of countries are spending a lot of money on infrastructure. So there's business to be had. There's work to be done. You spread the risk by exporting now. You expand your markets to offset your home demand. So you're not quite as reliant on one particular market or even a few markets. And you can look for new opportunities. There will be new opportunities in caused by a pandemic for people making a lot of money out of PPE, for example. You can also use this time to get ahead of the competition. That's one of the things we as a business have been doing, is to put ourselves forward as the thought leader, the technical leader in the market, so that when the markets return, where everyone is in a good position, they think about your company. So you're getting ahead of the competition, basically. Because if they're sitting around doing nothing, self-isolating, worrying about their market, you're pushing out there, showing people that you're still here and you're the leader in your market, then that will only be good for you moving forward. Of course, you do have to have a cautious approach to credit and credit risk, as more companies are under stress than they have been previously. But there are credit facilities available. UK government is extending some facilities which make it through UKEF, which make it easier to get trade finance. But also you can embrace new ways to communicate. We've all learned how to use the web, Zoom, and so on. So these are great ways of increasing our communication with overseas partners, in fact. What about Brexit? Is it all too difficult? We've looked at some of the complications. There are quite a lot of things that need to be done. Again, my answer is no, it's not all too difficult. We can't stand still. No way we can stand still. What you have to do is plan for it. You need to prepare. So compile your Brexit list, your Brexit checklist, all the things you need to do. Prepare for your customs and VAT changes that are going to come. These preparations will be worthwhile no matter what free trade agreement we enter into the EU. Particularly as so many of you are exporting outside of the area anyway, so those skills will be transferable. Every business needs to learn about certificates of origin, for example, and how to complete customs declarations. Take advantage of government support. There's money out there for training grants. There's some new finance going to be offered by the government, to match funding for consultancy services on exporting, to help export, for example. In terms of increasing markets or market research, that kind of thing. That's going to be announced shortly. Review approvals and licenses, review exposure. We've mentioned about CE and UKCA. There's going to be changes there. You need to, in particular, look at your CE conformity assessments. If they were carried out in the UK by notified bodies here, are they going to be recognised by the EU? Make sure your notified body has been doing something about that. And if not, you need to make some adjustments. And do you need, for example, an authorised representative in the EU to handle your compliance issues? That's a topic that we touched on in the previous webinar, but again, that can be an important point. With the difference in our trade now with the EU, we're a third-party country, so our distributors and our customers become the importer, and they have more commitments to check on RCE compliance, for example. We need to check our customer contracts and our supplier contracts. This includes distributors. We need to look at Incoterms, roles and responsibilities, importer status that we just mentioned, pricing, what effect is duties going to have, stock and delivery times. All of these things need to be taken into account. We need to assess the cost implications. We need to evaluate the duty on market, the effective duty on market competitiveness, and obviously review our cash flow implications of potentially having to have more stock, for example, or VAT, having to pay VAT in a different way. So it may seem there's a lot to do and it can be overwhelming, but it's not insurmountable providing you prepare. If you haven't already, please do start now. Get the help that's out there. Break it down into bite-sized chunks and create your checklist and schedule. And ask for outside expert help. For example, the Welsh Government is obviously providing a lot of support here. Companies like ourselves, the government, there's a lot of support out there. So please do search it out if you need it, but don't leave it too late. There really is no going back now. We've left the EU. That's not going to change. So whatever happens, we have to prepare and move on. But there are opportunities from Brexit as well. So we saw in the survey that a number of companies have only exported to the EU previously. And it's reckoned that 135,000 companies have only exported to the EU. So are you one of them? It's been easy up to now, but now all countries are treated the same. So we need customs declarations, we need certificates of origin everywhere, and the government's hoping to be free from EU constraints, but will it be? It's wanting to make decisions based on what's best for the UK. But there are opportunities. Brexit does create opportunities. It helps us to have new relationships with our existing customers, for example. Keep your customers and distributors close. Show them that you care and understand their concerns. Work with them to overcome the issues and the fears that they might have, and really work hard to ensure perfect execution of your orders from the 1st of January. These things can actually enhance your relationships. But don't be complacent. They may be looking elsewhere. They may be looking to spread their risk and have other suppliers from the EU. Is there an order that's been delayed? Well, maybe you better check and see what the reasons are. So expand your horizons beyond the known is one of the key things. The whole world now is an opportunity, and we're trading with the whole world on the same terms as we will be with the EU until we have free trade agreements with each area. So you'll gain new skills, knowledge and experience and confidence to look at the whole world of opportunities. So what does it mean for your export strategy? Well, positives and negatives of free trade agreements are increased trade, reduced tariffs, there's less red tape for sure within a free trade agreement, better market access, mutual recognition of standards and licenses and so on, which is a key area. Accumulation in rules of origin. We mentioned earlier about the goods from the other trading partners being classed as UK, so that you can get UK origin on products. Simplified VAT procedures where they exist, and it expands your horizons. But the negatives are there's greater home market competition from the countries that you've got a free trade agreement with. Proof of origin is definitely more onerous than under WTO rules, because under WTO rules, all countries are most favoured nations, so it doesn't matter which country the products or the components come from. Compliance costs may be higher depending on what the agreements are, and there's maybe an increase in non-economic requirements such as environmental factors. So there are positives and negatives with free trade agreements, but overall the positives far outweigh the negatives, and they're a good thing for our trade. So again, even with free trade agreements, we'll need to prove origin. We've already talked about this, so we'll go past that one now. So what should your export strategy be in the new normal? The EU is still our biggest trading partner. The first step you need to take is to keep your markets and your customers, ensure perfect execution of your orders and your business. Maintain your current markets, keep your customers very close. Look at the world, there's a whole world of opportunities, go beyond the known, apply these skills and knowledge that you're gaining to other areas. Free trade agreements will be one indicator of potential new markets, but you do need to evaluate carefully, as they will not cover all goods and they do sometimes bring additional work. And don't worry, WTO rules do still work. So if you're one of the industries where the duties are not so high, then it's not such a barrier to trade, as many of you have already found from what we saw earlier. And you need to consider all the factors when looking at your export strategy. So how do you assess market potential post-Brexit? Firstly, you narrow down the options. Where is there a free trade agreement? That's a clear indication that there's an option there. Knowledge and logic, you know that a big country is going to have more opportunity than a smaller country in terms of its market size. Assess your in-house data, see where your inquiries are coming from, see where you've sold goods to, and give you an indication of where the market may be coming from. Learn from your competitors, see where they're selling. And also you can do market research, market reports. You can commission that, or you can buy it. It's obviously cheap, or usually cheaper to get a consultancy company to, for example, to do a specific research. So is the existence of a free trade agreement all important on deciding where to look at new markets? Well, no, because you need to assess all of the terms of the free trade agreement. It's very important, but make sure that firstly you're covered within the free trade agreement, and make sure that the duty benefit over WTO rules is worth the additional work that may be involved. Look at rules of origin. Is accumulation allowed? Look at the amount of the reduction of red tape, approvals and standards, health and consumer protection, mutual recognition, and so on. All these areas that we've looked at. You need to assess all of these before deciding on which markets are going to be good. You need to assess also obviously the pound value and the growth of the market. It's not just the overall value, but the growth. If you've got one market which is 100 million, worth 100 million and growing at 30% a year, it's probably better than a 200 million market now, but which is declining. So you need to look at both factors in deciding which are markets to put your effort into if you've got limited resources and can't go everywhere at once. Obviously, you also have to look at your product, and is it adapted to the market? Is it going to be right for the markets you want to go into? And evaluate all the barriers to entry. So not just things that are included in a free trade agreement, like approvals and licenses, but for example, if a trade body membership is required in the country, that might be a barrier. What the competition's like, duties, obviously, logistics, language, currency, all of these things are key factors when you're deciding on your export markets or new export markets to look at, as is the country risk. I already mentioned about Venezuela. But does the free trade agreement, for example, include any guarantees on investment, security on investments, that kind of thing? So what you have to do is evaluate and compare countries in a scientific approach, list all those factors together, list all the factors affecting the evaluation, like free trade agreements and market size, growth rate, barriers to entry, etc. And assign an importance weighting to each factor. How important is each one of those to you in the markets you want to go to? And then for each factor, apply a rating. We usually say between 1 and 5. And then that generates a score for each factor. So the rating times the weighting gives you a score for each factor. You sum that up, and that will give you a total country score. That will allow you to compare to other countries and create a league table of priorities for countries to look at, to export to. If you'd like a template on how to do that, we have one available, which we'd be happy to supply to you. So in summary, as from the 21st of January 2021, we're out of the EU. Will there be a deal or no deal? Well, keep our fingers crossed. The UK and EU free trade agreements is imperative for continuity. For example, on rules of origin, accumulation effect. We're also out of all EU free trade agreements with third countries, and we need to mirror those agreements in order to maintain the trading that we're doing now. Will there be a new agreement with the free trade agreement with the US? And does it really matter? We've already seen we're still already selling 100 billion or so to the US. It's our second biggest trading partner. Free trade agreements are deeply integrated, and they can take years to negotiate because of all the elements that's around just trade. And they encompass so much more than just duties. Otherwise, we'll fall back on WTO rules, and you need to assess for your product what that impact is going to be. Definitely plan for Brexit, embrace change and the new skills that you're going to need, and use those to open a world of opportunities and new markets. There are positive and negatives to free trade agreements, and when you're looking at evaluating new markets to go to, carefully look at all the different factors, not just whether there's a free trade agreement. So in summary, expand your horizons. Brexit can be an opportunity. Free trade agreements can be an opportunity, but they also can be a difficulty. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you, Mike. That was excellent. A lot of valuable information there to digest. We've had a few questions in. First one we received: is there a go-to link to search for the WTO tariffs based on harmonized codes?
Yes, there is, and I'll send that over so it can be circulated.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Where can we find a list of duties for each country?
Yes, again, that will be the same link. There's a WTO. In fact, there's a new report just come out from the WTO which shows the duties applicable to each country. So I'll send a link to that, and that will cover all of that kind of information. But you can also look at the WTO website. That has the information on there as well.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. A couple of questions here related to the US and Australia markets. We export value-added snacking items that contain dairy and wheat to Australia and to the US. On goods exported to Australia, depending on the specific SKU, tariff duties are paid locally by our importer. Will these tariff levels remain the same as they are now, or increase, decrease?
No, I mean, with Australia and the US, certainly with the US, there's no European EU free trade agreement, so you're trading on WTO terms there anyway, so that won't change. And I believe that will be the same in Australia as well. So if you're already trading on WTO terms, then there won't be any change.
Okay, thank you. And from the follow-on question from the same company, also in regards to goods exported to the US, increased levels of duty are paid as a result of the current administration. Again, will these change as a result of the UK leaving the EU? And will the standard levels of duty tariff change at the same time too?
I think you're asking me to get into Mr. Trump's mind there, and that might be quite difficult. I think there's an element of tit for tat going on there, a trade war going on there, and that's is really probably separate to the leaving the EU, and it depends on the negotiations with the US on a future trade agreement.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And we have one final question. Is there a comparison between old duty and effective new duty? Struggling understanding whether if we import to the UK and pay duty, in effect, would we have to pay a second duty to export?
To export the same goods, I assume that's the question. So yeah, there is a system to be able to reclaim duty if you've imported something, paid duty on it, and then you're exporting it again, and there's another duty. So it depends on the product, and but you can look that up on the .gov UK website.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Mike. I think if there's no more questions, we'll draw this webinar to a close. If we could have the last slide, please, Mike.
Sorry.
There's some follow-on contact information there. The web address is the export zone, the Business Wales export zone, which also contains the export hub. That is a free resource to Welsh-based exporters, and that in addition contains some information on duties which you may find valuable. or if you're after some further support, the phone number there is for the Business Wales helpline. Again, support can be had from there. So I'd like to thank everyone today for attending, and thank you to Mike for presenting, and I will draw this webinar to a close. Thank you.